All right. So yeah, I just want to quickly talk about this new paper that it's a single author paper that I've worked on maybe already a year and a half ago or so. So this was, it's titled Private Sharing of Public Content on Facebook. And this was published just at a workshop at ICWSM. I was recently presenting it at Copenhagen last week. So the idea behind this paper is that there is a lot of public content, let's say news content. So New York Times reports a lot of news. So how much of it is shared publicly and how much of it is shared privately, right? Like so, privately meaning in private spaces like private groups on Facebook or direct messages or feed posts which are not publicly visible and things like that. So the hypothesis, at least going into it, and I have some evidence for it, is that this sort of private sharing of social networks is increasing, right? Like so, and the reason for that is if you think about the last time you use Facebook to share you going out with your friends publicly, people are not doing that. I mean, early social network days, that used to be a thing. So I go on a trip and I post a ton of my pictures on Facebook, and my friends will comment on it, or like I say, okay, I spent my weekend doing this on Facebook. And a lot of the times it was semi-public, right? Like, so my friends could see it, my friends of friends could see it, and things like that. uh, and that was, one way of doing it, but we've all come to the realization that that's not the way we use social networks nowadays. At least most of my use of social networks are professional. Like, Twitter, I post things publicly, but most of my sharing is private. Like, so I, put stuff on Google Photos and share a link on WhatsApp or on, iMessage and things like that. So that's the objective here. That's the idea. So is that, if you have this sort of iceberg, a lot of the content that we see in publicly accessible spaces, like public Facebook pages or public groups or public Telegram channels, things like that, is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of things like these private spaces, like private groups, direct messages, posts on feeds, and things like that, which we don't necessarily see. And especially for public content, like let's say news content that is spreading on Facebook, if you want to understand the dynamics of how these things spread, it's really important to understand both these spaces, right? And so the objective of this, okay, before going to the objective, like this is already happening. Like even the social networks know this, like Facebook knows this, right? Like Facebook used to push a lot infamously, like for public sharing. They just turned the setting public by default, like for infamously, like in 2010 or something like that. So they used to do this, but now, and Mark Zuckerberg really comes to the realization that, sharing in these sort of encrypted private messaging is the future. And so what we want to see is content that is shared publicly. So public content like news URLs, how much of it is shared privately, right? How often are public content that is shared in the public versus in private? And can we quantify this? Like, can we come up with a number that says, okay, this is the URL. Where if you just look at the public version of this, we only see, this fraction, and this is what we're missing of the shares and type of spread of information. And so this really is helpful for a bunch of stakeholders, like journalists studying misinformation, researchers, and content creators. So I'll go through each of them. For journalists, studying misinformation or fact checking, things like that, understanding the reach of their content is very important. So especially for like misinformation, this is an example from the 2020 election. This is on November 9th, 2020. This is not a screenshot that I took, so some journalists took it, so they put this sort of red marks on it. So this is not my marking. But basically, this is a YouTube video. I mean, crazy times in 2020. It claims, okay, there's something about Biden, not winning the election in Pennsylvania, something like that. So this is clear misinformation. But see the shares of this, like, okay, there are 1 million views to this video on YouTube. If you look at Facebook and how this is shared, there was a tool called CrowdTangle that Facebook provided that enabled us to see, publicly how many times these were shared. There's a publicly accessible groups on which this was shared is around 2,800 interactions. So this is a sum of likes, shares, comments, and things like that. But they also provide this other thing, which is the total interactions that we see on Facebook, and that is around 100,000, so 109,000. So what this is saying is that 98% of the interactions for this piece of content are private, right? Like, so meaning people are sharing them within their private groups, within their one-to-one chats and things like that. So if you just consider studying election misinformation on Facebook using CrowdTangle public data, you're missing out 98% of the interactions. So a lot of the ways in which this information is spreading and consumed is missing if you just focus on the public parts of it. Another is, related thing is content creators, news organizations, fact checkers, and things like that, marketers. So if you don't know your true reach, right, like who is seeing it and how are they seeing it, that's a problem. Finally, for us, researchers, especially, if we're thinking about move towards more private spaces or like understanding information dynamics and how they spread patterns and things like that, or like trying to study why do people share certain types of content where. So these are very important questions. And so to study this, what we did is we collected these aggregate share counts of news content on Facebook. There's this tool called CrowdTangle, uh, and it had this tool called link checker, which given a URL, it would give you counts of public and private shares for that link. So it looks like this. So you have a New York Times article here. So you go and click on the browser extension, and it'll show you, okay, on Facebook, these are the number of private shares, these are the number of public shares, and so on. Like this is, the screenshot I showed you earlier. So what we got is we got these counts for a lot of URLs. So the quantity of interest is this quantity called ratio, which is the ratio of public shares to the total shares. So if the quantity is close to zero, that means it's mostly private sharing, right? It's no public sharing. Quantity close to one means that it's mostly public sharing. Okay, and then we collected a bunch of data sets from different domains, like mainstream news, biased news, low quality, high quality news, fact checking, social media platforms like viral stuff on YouTube or Reddit, and a bunch of other things. And so there's three findings. The first finding is that a significant portion of the news content is shared privately. So even for like mainstream news sources like New York Times, majority of the content sharing occurs in private spaces. Let me show you an interactive CDF. So this is, by the way, this is a demo that I made in like 20 minutes on using Gemini. It's like a really like it's a publicly hosted website, so you can reload and check. It's a publicly hosted website like that I created. Just uploaded the paper and asked for a canvas, so it gave me this, and then I added some images. But this is really good. Like so, basically the way this helps is in yeah, these sorts of interactive plots. So for instance, okay, I can just zoom in here. So here we have a CDF of public share ratio, that quantity that I showed you. This is on the x-axis, and it has these 5 news sources. Let me remove these others. So just I have Fox News and New York Times right now. These are the CDFs. So this shows the fraction of URLs with a ratio less than a certain amount. So if I go to a certain value, so here the ratio is 0.2. The fraction of URLs which have a ratio less than 0.2 is for New York Times, it's 70% of the URLs have a ratio less than 0.2. Again, like close to zero means more private sharing. So 0.2 means that only 20% of the shares are public. So 70% of New York Times and Fox News URLs have 20% or less public sharing, meaning they're mostly shared privately, right? Like so, you can see this converges pretty quickly. So let's say 90% of these URLs have 0.6 or so ratio. So now let's add, other sources like, Breitbart, for instance. Breitbart is a partisan news source, lower quality, it's not mainstream as these others. And you see the trends are very different, right? Like, so for the same ratio amount, like, so 0.2, for instance, only 48% of the Breitbart URLs have like less than 0.2 ratio. So meaning they're shared, Breitbart is shared much more publicly than privately, which is again not sort of counterintuitive, like to what I would have expected. I would have expected that these Breitbart, Newsmax is even much more publicly shared. Again, like this has the reason for this could be a ton of other reasons that we don't know, like the Facebook news feed and how much these kinds of news sources are promoted and so on. Like for instance, New York Times, Fox News are much more mainstream, so Facebook might show them more in the news feeds privately. But these others are more partisan, so they may not be shown. Right? If you don't know the reason, but at least this is interesting, right? Like, so firstly, that for mainstream news sources, a lot of their shares are private, and for partisan news sources, at least my hypothesis would have been that they are much more private because they have a lot of conspiracies, misinformation, and things like that, and they would be shared much more privately. But that's not the case. COVID news is a collection of news about COVID, like it's somewhere in the middle. Okay. Yeah. So next, what we did is we got these content categories. So if you go to any news website, New York Times, the Huffington Post, you have these top level categories, things like news, politics, entertainment, life, personal, and so on, and looked at what is the ratio for each of these categories. And there's a huge range. Like, so if you look at the most public ones, these are the generic ones, like, environment, culture, entertainment, things like that. Most private ones are like, these are mostly privately shared content, like religion, money, food and drink, and things like that. Again, intuitive, but interesting, right? Like, so this the range is super wide, like, so it's around 0.6, 0.7 here, and zero point 0.2 here for the bottom ones. So, religion, for instance, only 20% of them are shared publicly. But for environment, it's around 80% of them, or 70% of them are shared publicly. Then we looked at detailed topics, like, what are the topics that people, so instead of just looking at, entertainment, politics, and things like that, we looked at actual content of the news articles, extracted topics from them. And we see again, like very interesting, controversial, conspiratorial topics are shared mostly privately, things like vaccines, abortion, conspiracy theories about COVID, and so on. They're being shared much more privately compared to, sports, NBA, politics, relationships, and things like that. They're being shared more publicly. Okay, so just to wrap up, so I mean, this is a short paper, so I really don't have a diagnosis here. Like, so, it's just showing the scale at which we are missing data if we just focus on public data. Even like now, with DSA or like any mandates on release of data, there's a balance here. Okay, obviously private data is private, but the scale is alarming, right? Like, so if you're studying even public content, the spread in private spaces is so big. Like, so you're missing a lot of content if you don't know what you're missing. So that's very important. Studies focusing on only public data may overlook a significant share of this activity. And a lot of the private sharing can be influential, right? Like, so if you get it from your friends or family, that's much more influential than you reading it, from a random source on Facebook. So this is the takeaway is that, this is something that we should as academics care about, especially, when we're making policy about how data should be released and things like that. There are ways in which, like, Facebook has done it in the past with anonymization, some sort of privacy preserving ways in which you can release this sort of shares in private spaces as well, especially for public content. Like, so this is not private, it's not a picture of my kids or my cat or whatever, like that's private, like, but this is public content. So yeah, this should be really something we should be thinking about. Yeah, thank you.